Hi, welcome to LCC, Mr. Davis. What are the main messages you are trying to deliver during your keynote?
Well, the main lesson of anthropology really is that every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. The sort of the central idea of anthropology is cultural relativism, and really all that means is that the world into which you were born is in some sense one model of reality, the consequence of a set of choices that your particular cultural lineage made, however successfully. But the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is sort of a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to become human and alive? And, in a multicultural world, all those voices matter. And together they become kind of the human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that we will confront in the coming centuries. And the curse of humanity has always been what one might call cultural myopia, the idea that my world's a real world and you're a failed attempt at being me. And that's an ancient impulse of humanity. Many tribal groups will translate their name, it means of the people, the implication being that everybody else is a savage, or the word barbarian comes from the Greek word barbers. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. And I've always argued, and I think anthropology argues, is that cultural myopia has been our singular curse, the cause of war and conflict. And if we can somehow liberate ourselves from that, we can truly find a way to live in an interconnected world where every voice is heard and each is respected.
Thank you very much. And what does the conference theme, Bring Your Difference, mean to you?
Well, bring your difference is just that, is that everybody being encouraged to stand proudly about their own heritage, about their own traditions. And none of this is about, the traditional versus the modern. It's all about what kind of world do we want to live. And none of this is to say that any particular culture should be frozen in time like some kind of zoological specimen. It's how do we find ways that the best of what we do, say in the West, which you can't use that term West anymore. Technology is popping out of China and Japan and all over the damn world. But all that world that is sort of based on the scientific method, of technology, engineering, and so on, has brought us such wonderful things. Allopathic medicine. Lord, if any of us ripped off an arm in a car accident, we wouldn't want to be taken to a shaman. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that other cultures don't have something to say about other aspects. One of the things that we've done in that Western tradition, which is now spread, if you will, into an international paradigm, is that we really have de-animated the world. We have, in probably trying to escape what could have been the tyranny of religious faith, we went sort of too far, and we sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater, and forgot that not just magic or mysticism, but the key thing is metaphor. We are so literal that if something can't be measured, it can't exist. But in fact, a lot of the relationships, and I think that's why we treat the world as we do. You and I are kind of raised to think it's quite normal to simply tear apart a mountain to get the coal that's within the mountain. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use coal. Well, actually, I am saying we shouldn't use coal, but there's lots of, obviously, resources we need to use. But the attitude we have learned to embrace it is as if it doesn't matter, just tear open that mountain. That's what we do. Well, most cultures in the world wouldn't agree with that. They'd say, wait a minute, that mountain is a sacred being. And that doesn't mean they wouldn't exploit that mountain for human needs, but they would do so with a slightly different reverence to it. So if you try to ask yourself, how are we going to find a way to move forward as a species? Take climate change, for example. Climate change has become humanity's problem. But it's important for us to all remember it wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by a very narrow subset of humanity, this kind of industrial model. And as one person wrote, we've been eating consuming the ancient sunlight of the earth for 400 years, But it's only 300-400 years, so we have a pretty short history, And in that time, this way of thinking about the Earth has sort of brought us to a problematic situation. So it's not that anyone is suggesting we go backwards to a pre-industrial world. I mean, I wrote a book called The Wayfinders, where the editor put a subtitle, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World, and it kind of forced me to answer that. And I did so in the end with 2 words, climate change. Not to suggest that any of us go back to a pre-industrial past or that any society be kept from the genius of modernity, be that medicine or be it science or technology, but simply climate change is the very existence of these other visions of life, these other interpretations of reality, these other cultural paradigms, ways of being, remind us that our way is not the only way. And it kind of puts a lie to those of us within our own worldview. And I don't mean our own culture. I mean, it's a worldview that is shared, all modern, but those of us in that worldview of whatever you call it, corporate capitalism, whatever you call it, for those who say that it puts the very existence of all these other visions of life puts a lie to those in that world who are saying we cannot change when we all know we must change the fundamental way we occupy the planet. I mean, I think, in climate change has reached this place where, it's not just a matter that no one's debating it anymore, or that the voices of the so-called skeptics have been silenced finally. I think people around the world are now feeling climate change, the forest fires, the storms. You'd have to be an idiot not to be personally. And I think that's a good thing, because it will mean that hopefully within, whether it's too late or not, I can't say, but I think hopefully the climate change will come to be seen as just the backdrop of our lives, a kind of, and in that sense, an existential reality and an existential threat that no one's going to be sitting around trying to argue it doesn't happen, or and in that, I think that the very fact that there are other ways of thinking and being can be inspirational and liberate us from those who continue to say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. There's no way we can be different.
So, as a well-known anthropologist, and photographer, and author, what makes you so different? Can you share with us?
I've been very fortunate, but I think there's certain lessons for young people. We're always taught that life's linear. Think of A to B to C to D, and if you don't get to E and F, you'll never get to the rest of the alphabet. If you actually look at a successful life, it's all been built around moments of serendipity, where you have a crossroads where you have to make a choice. And the most important thing for a young person, and it's not easy to do, is to cultivate an inner compass so that when you come to those crossroads, you're not listening to your parents, your peers, even your teachers, or your friends, that you're somehow, you own those decisions. Because the greatest creative challenge is actually the challenge to become the architect of your own life. And in old age, bitterness comes to those who look back on a life of decisions imposed upon them. And happiness and contentment generally comes to those who look back. They don't necessarily agree that every choice was the right one, but they've owned the choice, they're responsible for it. And so they feel that they've controlled and owned their own destiny. And that seems to be a key to contentment. And when you are young, it's really important to be an opportunist. I don't mean a schemer. I mean, put yourself in the way of opportunities where there is no choice but success. And suddenly you find yourself capable of doing things that would have been beyond your imaginings a few months before. You've had that experience. And so when I was young, I had no idea what I wanted to do. In fact, I was so confused. And in fact, the way I became an anthropologist was almost laughable. The deadline was the next day to stay at the university, and I had happened to walk out of Harvard's Ethnology Museum, and with my head still full of all these images of shaman and native people, I ran into a friend, and I said, what are you going to major in? And he said, anthropology. And I said, what's that? And he said, you read about Indians. And like Forrest Gump, I said, that'll do. That's how I became an anthropologist. But I always had one word in my vocabulary for new experience, yes. Jim Whittaker, the first American to summit Everest, is a friend of mine, and Jim always says that if you don't live on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And you have to remember that, there are 1,000 teachers out there that you don't even know you have. A taxi cab driver can have as much to teach you as a professor. And it's important to remember that orthodoxy is the enemy of invention, that despair is an insult to the imagination, that pessimism is an indulgence. You have to do what you need to do and then ask whether it was possible or permissible. I've got a young daughter who's 30 who I adore, and she's a brilliant musician. And she asked me once whether she thought she should be a musician. And my first answer had to be no. Because if you have to ask, not because I'm some father who wants her to go to business school, but I said to her, honey, if you have to ask that question, the answer has to be no, because no musician asks that question. If I had tried to plot my way to my career, everybody said, how did you become who you are? Well, it's one step at a time. You see a presentation like that, all those images, all those places, and I'm sure a lot of the kids may have liked the talk, but a lot of them will think, well, I'll never be able to do that. Well, of course they can. I'm 65. You're what, 16 or what? 16. Of course you haven't done that yet, but my life is almost over. Yours is just beginning, right? And so you need to do what you need to do and not calculate your way through. I mean, if you calculate your way through, your life is pretty predictable. If you seek, if your goal in life is to make money, well, I'm not saying don't become a stockbroker, but don't have any expectations that you're going to be able to do that kind of thing if you're going to be a stockbroker. I'm not saying, I don't say any particular, but I think you want to give your destiny time to find you. There is so much pressure comes down on young people, from parents, especially if you're, Asian families really put a lot of pressure on the kids, as you know. Immigrant families always put a lot, for all kinds of understandable reasons. You want to give honor to your parents, but you have to give your destiny time to find you. My sister, I'm very close to my sister, and she always says that the thing that the public and never asks you and has no idea is how tough you are. And what she meant by that is not physically tough, but when I was young, nobody was more desperately keen to find out what I was going to do, and I didn't know. I couldn't see out there a form of a job that I could live my life in. And so for 10 years I just struggled with that. I mean, I was doing all kinds of interesting things, but fundamentally and until I wrote that first book, I didn't know what I was going to be. And I was in my early 30s, so for 10 years it was very, well, my dad would say dicey, but my dad never pressured me. The point is, the key thing is I was patient, in effect. Not because I was patient, but I just was too confused not to be, but I gave my destiny time to find me. A career, like a life, is not something you put on like a cloak. You don't go eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I want to be a banker, I want to be an accountant, I want to be a diplomat. A life and a career is something that builds around you, step by step, choice by choice. Nothing is beneath you unless you make it so. Nothing is a waste of time unless you treat it that way. I mean, the months that I spent in a logging camp were every bit as significant to my life as the months I spent as a graduate student at Harvard. So the main thing I say to parents is to be patient. It takes time for a young person to craft something as complex and unique as an individual human life. And to young people I say, please be patient and give your destiny time to find you. And one final thought, just to realize how crazy I was. When I was 23, I was so desperate to know what I was going to do that I applied to graduate school in botany and to law school at the same time, as if they were the same thing. And I got into both. And I happened to go pick up my sister at her law firm, this posh law firm in Vancouver. And there was a wonderful old lady, I guess she was a receptionist or whatever, behind the desk. She took one look at me and she said, "Are you Wade? You're Karen's brother Wade. You just came back from the Amazon. you eat all these weird plants. Yeah, it's me. You follow me. And she walked me back through the corridors to the law library where all these dull law books were, right? And she had put a ladder up that would bring my eyes eye to eye of an old lithograph from the 18th century of a British solicitor, fat, wig, hook nose, and she said, "You look at that." I looked at it, and she said, "Is that you?" And I looked at it and I said, "No!" I crawled down, went to the front desk, called the law school, retracted my application. And I went to botany school. But like that was a fairy godmother, right? Because if I'd gone to law school, it would have been absolute unmitigated disaster.
Thank you. So talking about teenagers, on one hand, we want to be different from others, but on the other hand, we don't want to be differentiated from others. So what are your suggestions to us?
Yeah, I mean, everybody romanticizes high school, but I've never met anyone who actually had a good experience in high school. I mean, teenage years aren't for the faint-hearted. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to find out who you are. And we live in a society where we don't, we don't have initiation rights. I mean, obviously Jewish people have bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs, and there's a certain amount, but we don't generally do much for young people to help them make these transitions, if you think about it. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to go back to a traditional culture where, at the time of your first menses, you suddenly become a woman, you go to the woman's hut, and then you have babies, and that's it. Obviously, we don't want that any more than we want to take a young man and circumcise him and make him a warrior and put, we can't say, it's kind of silly to say we don't have initiation rights. But the truth is that initiation rights in traditional society, which means for most of human history, were the way that we learned how to be adults, right? You'd be a little girl, you'd be initiated, you became a woman, you became a mother, and that was that. Well, we don't have that anymore, obviously. And at the same time, we haven't really substituted anything. So I think the difficulty of teenage years is very much a creation of our society, And that said, to teenagers, I always just, you just got to get through it. It's it shouldn't be as difficult as it can be, but when you add on the pressure of getting into a fancy university on top of everything, when you go to a good school like this, it's not easy. But I think that part of our problem is we sort of pretend it is supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be, your high school is supposed to be your lovely years, I've never known it. I can't think of anyone who looks back on high school as having been a pleasant experience. I'm not saying this isn't a good school or you're not having fun and great opportunities and have great friends, but there is this kind of fantasy. I remember when I was in high school, you would not know this, there used to be a comic book called Archie, right? And it was basically about a kind of mythical high school. It was Betty and Veronica and Jughead and Moose and all that. And it was kind of this kind of goofy, everybody having fun, getting in trouble high school. And I used to read that comic and I think, where is that high school? It's certainly nothing I've ever seen, So I think in a way, it would be more helpful to kind of acknowledge that these years are challenging. It's years where you're going from being, in your case, a girl to a woman, boy to a man. You've got the incredible pressure of the peer group. You're growing up in a world where social media can be the most horrific of tyrannies. We have the illusion of connectivity when all we're really doing is watching pixels of each other. The whole language of social media is in fact as if conceived to deceive. Snapchat, we don't actually chat with anybody. Facebook, we don't really look at anyone's face. So I think it's a challenging time, and there are also economic things going on. The housing thing is just completely bizarre. Whole generations of kids who will not be able to live in the cities of their birth. So there's, but that said, I should say there's never been an easy time to grow up. I grew up in the 1970s. My God, inflation was out of control, and oil crises, and Watergate, and one of the good lessons for young people is to remember that anyone who thinks they can change the world is both wrong and dangerous. And that was Peter Matthewson. He didn't mean that you shouldn't do good works, but the minute that you think, what he had in mind was people like Hitler, Mao, and Stalin, right? They set out, Mao didn't think he was doing anything wrong. Stalin didn't think he was doing anything wrong. They ended up killing, as did Hitler, right? And so the other thing is that I found when you stop thinking that you're going to change the world, and you suddenly, it's more of a Buddhist thing where you think that that life is not a destination but a pilgrimage. It's a path. And so there is no destination. The destination is the path. And then you suddenly realize that you don't do what you do necessarily to seek an end, changing the world or changing this or changing that. You do it because it's the right thing to do. And then what happens is you don't get bitter. So you can do what I've managed to do, is live a long life of productivity where I've never lost my ideals. I'm 65 almost. I'm as idealistic. I'm not naive, but I continue to do, you can tell from that presentation, I still believe in the decency of the human heart. I still believe in the righteousness of people. I still want to celebrate that. I haven't in any way become bitter, and I'm no less, in a sense, idealistic than I was when I was 20. It's just that I don't have any expectations of being able to achieve anything because I no longer care. It's not about the achievement, it's about the doing. And that's something Buddhism has taught me.